The earth trembled beneath Edinburgh at 2 o'clock in the morning on February 10th, 1567. Windows shattered across the Scottish capital as a thunderous roar split the winter night. Citizens bolted upright in their beds, convinced the world was ending. But this was no act of God. This was murder, executed with the precision of a military operation and the cold calculation of royal ambition. At the epicenter of this explosion lay Kirk O'Field, a modest two-story lodging house that had, until moments before, housed Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, the 21-year-old husband of Mary, Queen of Scots. The building had been obliterated, reduced to nothing more than scattered stone and splintered timber. The blast was so powerful it hurled debris hundreds of yards in every direction, embedding chunks of masonry into neighboring walls like cannonballs. Yet when the smoke cleared and the first investigators arrived at the scene, they discovered something that would baffle forensic minds for centuries. Lord Darnley's body lay not in the ruins of his bedroom, but in a garden 30 yards away from the destroyed house. He was completely naked, his pale skin unmarked by burns or blast injuries. Beside him lay his personal servant, equally pristine, equally dead. Neither man showed any signs of explosive trauma. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. This wasn't just another nobleman's death in turbulent 16th century Scotland. This was the assassination that would topple a kingdom, destroy a queen, and create one of history's most enduring forensic puzzles. The evidence at Kirk O'Field would challenge everything contemporaries believed about the circumstances of Darnley's death, and modern crime scene analysis only deepens the mystery. The positioning of the bodies defied logic. Explosion victims are typically found buried under debris, their clothing torn or burned, their bodies bearing the violent marks of sudden destruction. Yet here were two men, laid out as if they had simply fallen asleep in a garden, their nightclothes removed with almost surgical precision. One of Darnley's slippers lay beside him, the other several feet away. A chair sat nearby, perfectly upright and undamaged. Even more puzzling were the personal effects scattered around the scene. A coat, a belt, and a dagger, all arranged with an almost theatrical quality that suggested deliberate placement rather than the random chaos of an explosion. The forensic implications were staggering. Someone had either moved these bodies after the blast, or the explosion itself was mere window dressing for a murder that had already taken place. The timing, too, was suspicious. Mary, Queen of Scots, had visited her ailing husband earlier that evening, spending several hours at his bedside in what appeared to be a gesture of reconciliation. The royal couple's marriage had been deteriorating rapidly, marked by public arguments, political disagreements, and Darnley's increasingly erratic behavior. Yet on this particular night, Mary had shown unusual attention to her husband's comfort, personally overseeing his care before departing Kirk O'Field just hours before the explosion. When word of the blast reached Holyrood Palace, Mary's reaction was recorded by several witnesses as surprisingly composed for a woman who had just lost her husband in a catastrophic accident. She ordered an immediate investigation, but her instructions seemed more focused on controlling the narrative than uncovering the truth. Within hours, she had already begun referring to the incident as a mischance, an unfortunate accident rather than the obvious assassination it appeared to be. The physical evidence told a different story entirely. The quantity of gunpowder required to level Kirk O'Field would have filled multiple barrels, far too much for a single person to transport and position without assistance. The blast pattern suggested the explosives had been placed strategically throughout the building's foundation, indicating detailed planning and architectural knowledge. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a meticulously orchestrated execution. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins, one question dominated every conversation in Edinburgh. Who had the power, the motive, and the resources to murder the Queen's husband so spectacularly? The answer would lead investigators into a web of political intrigue, forbidden love, and royal betrayal that stretched from the humblest servants to the throne itself. To understand why Lord Darnley died so violently, one must first understand why he lived so dangerously. The marriage between Mary Stuart and Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, had been doomed from its very conception. A union born of political necessity that quickly descended into personal hatred, public humiliation, and ultimately murderous intent. Mary, Queen of Scots, had returned to Scotland in 1561 as a 19-year-old widow, her first husband, the French Dauphin Francis II, having died after barely 2 years of marriage. She was Catholic in a newly Protestant nation, French-educated in a fiercely Scottish court. And perhaps most dangerously, she was a woman ruling in her own right in an age when female sovereignty was viewed as an aberration against natural order. The pressure to remarry was immediate and overwhelming. Every eligible nobleman in Europe saw Mary as the ultimate prize. She was young, beautiful, and her marriage would determine not only Scotland's future, but potentially England's as well. Mary was Elizabeth the first cousin and, in the eyes of many Catholics, the rightful heir to the English throne. Her choice of husband would be a political act with continental implications. Lord Darnley seemed the perfect solution to Mary's impossible situation. He was her cousin, sharing the Tudor bloodline that strengthened both their claims to the English succession. He was tall, handsome, and charming when he chose to be. Most importantly, he was Catholic but acceptable to Protestant nobles, and his marriage to Mary would unite two powerful Scottish families, the Stuarts and the Stuarts. The wedding took place on July 29th, 1565, at Holyrood Palace, a ceremony that appeared to promise political stability and personal happiness. Mary seemed genuinely infatuated with her new husband, showering him with titles, lands, and the coveted designation King of Scots, an honor that made Darnley Mary's equal in rank, if not in power. For a brief moment, it seemed Scotland had found its perfect royal couple. The illusion shattered within months. Darnley's true character emerged with devastating clarity. He was vain, petulant, politically naive, and possessed of an explosive temper that made him dangerous to friend and foe alike. Worse still, he harbored ambitions that far exceeded his abilities. He demanded the crown matrimonial, which would have made him king in his own right and allowed him to rule Scotland even if Mary died. When Mary refused, Darnley's resentment festered into open hostility. The breaking point came with the brutal murder of David Riccio, Mary's Italian secretary and confidant. On the evening of March 9th, 1566, Darnley led a group of conspirators into Mary's private chambers at Holyrood Palace. They dragged the terrified Riccio from the Queen's presence and stabbed him 56 times in an adjoining room, his screams echoing through the corridors as Mary, 6 months pregnant at the time, was forced to watch helplessly. Darnley's motive was jealousy, pure and vicious. He had convinced himself that Mary and Riccio were lovers, though no credible evidence supported this belief. More likely, he resented Riccio's influence over Mary and saw the secretary as an obstacle to his own political ambitions. The murder was meant to demonstrate Darnley's power and eliminate a rival from Mary's attention. Instead, it destroyed whatever remained of Mary's affection for her husband. She never forgave Darnley for the trauma he had inflicted. Not just the murder itself, but the psychological torture of forcing her to witness such brutality while carrying his child. From that moment forward, their marriage became a carefully choreographed performance for public consumption, while privately, Mary began to seek solace elsewhere. Enter James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, a man who represented everything Darnley was not. Where Darnley was weak, Bothwell was powerful. Where Darnley was unreliable, Bothwell was steadfast. Where Darnley brought chaos, Bothwell offered protection. Mary's growing dependence on Bothwell became the talk of the Scottish court, and Darnley, despite his own failures as a husband, seethed with jealous rage. By late 1566, the royal marriage had become a public embarrassment and a private hell. Mary refused to share Darnley's bed, conducted state business without consulting him, and made no effort to hide her preference for Bothwell's company. Darnley, in turn, threatened to leave Scotland entirely, taking their infant son James with him, a move that would have been both treasonous and catastrophic for Mary's reign. The situation was unsustainable. Something had to give, and everyone at court knew it. What nobody anticipated was how violently the resolution would arrive, or how the explosion at Kirk O'Field would forever change the course of Scottish history. In the winter of 1566, Lord Darnley fell gravely ill with what contemporary physicians diagnosed as smallpox, though modern medical historians suspect syphilis, a disease that would explain both his erratic behavior and the urgent need for discretion surrounding his treatment. This illness, whether natural or convenient, would become the perfect cover for the most elaborate royal assassination plot in Scottish history. Darnley had been staying in Glasgow with his father, the Earl of Lennox, when a mysterious ailment struck. Reports from the household described fever, painful lesions, and a rash that left his once handsome face severely disfigured. He was confined to bed for weeks, raving in delirium and demanding to see his wife. Mary, who had been conspicuously absent from her husband's side during his illness, suddenly announced her intention to visit him personally, a decision that surprised everyone at court. The journey from Edinburgh to Glasgow in January 1567 was treacherous, requiring Mary to travel through snow-covered hills and frozen streams. For a queen who had shown nothing but contempt for her husband for months, this sudden display of wifely devotion seemed remarkably out of character. Yet Mary made the arduous journey, arriving at Glasgow with a small entourage and immediately taking charge of Darnley's medical care. What transpired during those private conversations between husband and wife remains one of history's great mysteries. No reliable record exists of their discussions, but the outcome was clear. Mary convinced the bedridden Darnley to return with her to Edinburgh for better medical treatment. She suggested Kirk O'Field, a modest two-story house just outside the city walls, as the perfect location for his convalescence, quiet, secluded, and close enough to Holyrood Palace for her to visit regularly. Kirk O'Field belonged to the brother of James Balfour, a man whose loyalty had been purchased by the Earl of Bothwell years earlier. The choice of location was supposedly made for Darnley's comfort and privacy, but the house's isolation would prove far more beneficial to his enemies than to his recovery. The building sat apart from Edinburgh's main thoroughfares, surrounded by open ground that would contain any potential explosion while minimizing witnesses. Darnley arrived at Kirk O'Field on January 31st, 1567, carried on a litter and still weak from his illness. Mary had the house lavishly appointed for his comfort. Tapestries hung on the walls, carpets covered the floors, and a magnificent bed was installed in the upper chamber. She even moved some of her own furniture into the house, including a beautiful bath that she claimed would aid in his recovery. To outside observers, it appeared Mary was genuinely attempting to reconcile with her estranged husband. For the next 10 days, Mary visited Darnley daily, sometimes spending hours at his bedside. Servants reported that she seemed genuinely caring, personally supervising his meals and medications. She brought musicians to entertain him and courtiers to provide conversation. Darnley, perhaps sensing an opportunity to salvage their marriage, responded positively to Mary's attention. He grew stronger, more cheerful, and began speaking hopefully about their future together. But beneath this domestic tranquility, darker preparations were underway. The Earl of Bothwell had been making frequent visits to Kirk O'Field, ostensibly to check on the security arrangements, but actually to oversee the placement of gunpowder throughout the building's foundation. Barrels of explosive material were smuggled into the house under cover of darkness, concealed beneath the very chambers where Darnley was recovering. The irony was exquisite. While Mary nursed her husband back to health above, Bothwell was preparing his tomb below. The same isolation that provided privacy for Darnley's convalescence would soon provide cover for his assassination. The caring attention that seemed to promise marital reconciliation was actually ensuring that Darnley would be healthy enough to provide a satisfying target for his murderers. Mary's behavior during this period was masterful in its deception. She played the role of the devoted wife so convincingly that even Darnley's suspicious father began to believe in the possibility of genuine reconciliation. She attended to details that only a caring spouse would consider: the quality of his bedding, the temperature of his room, the timing of his medications. Yet every kindness was calculated every gesture of affection designed to keep Darnley exactly where her conspirators needed him. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on February 9th, when Mary announced a grand celebration at Holyrood Palace for the wedding of one of her servants. She invited Darnley to attend, knowing he was still too weak to leave Kirk O'Field for an extended evening. This provided her with the perfect alibi. She would be surrounded by witnesses at the palace while her husband met his fate at the isolated lodging house. As February 10th dawned, everything was in position. The gunpowder was in place, the alibis were established, and Darnley was exactly where his killers wanted him. The only question remaining was whether Mary's performance as the loving wife had been convincing enough to deflect suspicion from the horrific events about to unfold. The choice of Kirk O'Field as Lord Darnley's final residence was no accident. It was a calculated selection that reveals the methodical planning behind one of history's most spectacular assassinations. Every aspect of this modest lodging house made it ideal for murder, from its isolated location to its structural vulnerabilities, creating what modern security experts would recognize as a perfectly engineered kill zone. Kirk O'Field sat on the southern outskirts of Edinburgh, far enough from the city center to muffle any sounds of violence, yet close enough to Holyrood Palace to maintain the pretense of Mary's wifely concern. The house occupied a large plot of open ground, with no neighboring buildings close enough to provide unwelcome witnesses. This isolation, presented to Darnley as ensuring his privacy during recovery, actually guaranteed that his killers could work without observation. The building itself was a death trap waiting to be sprung. Constructed of local stone with thick walls and a timber roof, Kirk O'Field appeared solid and secure. But these same sturdy walls that promised protection would amplify the force of any internal explosion, turning the structure into a massive stone bomb. The house's two-story design created perfect conditions for placing explosives in the lower level, while keeping the target safely positioned above, unaware of the deadly preparations below his feet. James Balfour, the building's owner and a key conspirator in the plot, had intimate knowledge of Kirk O'Field's layout and structural weaknesses. His brother Robert, who nominally controlled the property, was either complicit in the conspiracy or conveniently absent when crucial decisions were made. This family connection ensured that the conspirators had unrestricted access to the building, allowing them to modify it for their murderous purposes without raising suspicions. The Earl of Bothwell, Mary's most trusted ally and the operation's likely mastermind, had been conducting what he calls security inspections of Kirk O'Field for days before Darnley's arrival. These visits allowed him to assess the building's vulnerabilities and plan the placement of explosives with military precision. Bothwell was an experienced soldier who understood siege warfare and demolition, skills that would prove invaluable in orchestrating Darnley's destruction. The gunpowder required for such a massive explosion couldn't be obtained quietly through normal channels. Historical records suggest that Bothwell accessed military supplies from Edinburgh Castle, where his political connections gave him authority over armaments. The sheer quantity needed, enough to level a substantial stone building, indicates this was no amateur operation, but a carefully resourced military action disguised as domestic violence. Storage of the explosives presented its own challenges. Gunpowder in the 16th century was notoriously unstable, sensitive to moisture, heat, and accidental ignition. The conspirators needed a location within Kirk O'Field that was dry, secure, and close enough to the building's structural supports to ensure complete destruction. The lower level provided the perfect solution: cellars and ground floor rooms that could accommodate the necessary barrels while remaining hidden from Darnley and his servants above. The timing of the operation required exquisite coordination. The explosives had to be in place before Darnley arrived, but not so early that their presence might be discovered during routine maintenance or cleaning. The 10-day period of Darnley's convalescence provided the perfect window, long enough to complete the preparations methodically, yet short enough to maintain operational security. Most crucially, Kirk O'Field's location allowed for multiple escape routes. The open ground surrounding the house meant the conspirators could approach from various directions, complete their work, and withdraw without being channeled through predictable choke points. This strategic advantage would prove essential when the time came to retreat from the scene of their crime. The psychological aspect of the location was equally important. By choosing a house associated with healing and reconciliation, the conspirators created a narrative of tragic irony. Darnley would die in the very place where his marriage was supposedly being restored. This location allowed Mary to maintain her facade of caring wife right up until the moment of the explosion, providing her with the perfect emotional cover for the conspiracy. Even the seasonal timing played into the conspirators' hands. February in Scotland meant long nights and harsh weather, conditions that kept honest citizens indoors and provided natural concealment for suspicious activities. The winter darkness would hide the movement of men and materials, while the cold would discourage casual observers from lingering outdoors where they might witness incriminating behavior. The servants' quarters within Kirk O'Field presented both opportunities and risks for the conspiracy. While loyal retainers might discover the plot, carefully chosen accomplices could provide inside intelligence about Darnley's routines and security arrangements. The household staff would need to be either eliminated or silenced, a consideration that would soon become bloodily relevant to the night's events. As February 10th approached, Kirk O'Field stood ready to fulfill its deadly purpose. Every stone, every timber, every barrel of concealed gunpowder had been positioned to ensure that when the moment came, Lord Darnley's death would be both spectacular and complete. The stage was set for royal murder on an unprecedented scale. The final hours of Lord Darnley's life began with what appeared to be an evening of genuine marital harmony. On the night of February 9th, 1567, Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived at Kirk O'Field in high spirits, accompanied by a small retinue of courtiers. She had come directly from a wedding celebration at Holyrood Palace, and her mood seemed genuinely festive as she climbed the stairs to her husband's chamber. Darnley, still recovering but much improved from his mysterious illness, welcomed his wife warmly. Contemporary accounts describe him as almost pathetically grateful for her attention, desperate to believe that their marriage might yet be salvaged. Mary played her role perfectly. She was affectionate, attentive, and gave every appearance of a woman rediscovering love for her husband. They shared supper, spoke of their young son James, and discussed plans for Darnley's return to court once his health was fully restored. The evening took on an almost domestic quality that must have seemed miraculous to Darnley. For months, Mary had barely acknowledged his existence, conducting state business around him and making no effort to hide her preference for other company. Now, suddenly, she was the wife he had always wanted, present, caring, and focused entirely on his well-being. If he suspected this transformation was too good to be true, he chose to ignore his doubts in favor of hope. Around 11 o'clock, Mary's demeanor shifted subtly. She became restless, checking the time repeatedly and glancing toward the windows as if expecting something. When a messenger arrived from Holyrood Palace, she seized upon the interruption with obvious relief. The wedding festivities required her immediate presence. She explained to Darnley, some crisis with the entertainment that only the Queen could resolve. Darnley protested her departure, pleading with Mary to remain for the night. He was lonely, he said, and her presence brought him comfort he hadn't felt in months. Mary's response was masterfully calculated. She promised to return the following evening for a longer visit, perhaps even to stay the night if his health permitted. She kissed him goodbye, a gesture recorded by servants as surprisingly tender, and descended the stairs for what both knew, though only Mary acknowledged, would be the last time. As Mary's entourage departed Kirk O'Field, heading back toward the lights of Edinburgh, a different kind of activity began in the shadows around the isolated house. Dark figures moved through the winter night, men who had been waiting for precisely this signal. The Earl of Bothwell's carefully chosen accomplices emerged from their hiding places, ready to complete the final preparations for what would become Scotland's most infamous royal assassination. The gunpowder had been in position for days, but the final connections, the fuses that would carry fire from the outside to the explosive charges within, required last-minute installation. This delicate work had to be completed in absolute darkness, with men working by touch rather than sight to avoid detection. The winter wind that howled around Kirk O'Field provided perfect acoustic cover for the soft sounds of their preparations. Inside the house, Darnley settled into his bed, apparently unaware of the deadly activity below. His personal servant, William Taylor, remained with him as always, while a page named Thomas Nelson prepared for sleep in an adjacent room. These men, loyal to their master and innocent of any involvement in the conspiracy, will become collateral damage in the night's events, their deaths as certain as Darnley's once the fuses were lit. Midnight came and went with no sign of unusual activity. Darnley may have dozed fitfully, his recovering body still weak from illness and the emotional strain of the evening's reconciliation with Mary. The household settled into the quiet rhythms of night, with only the wind and the occasional crackle from dying fires to disturb the peace. Outside, the conspirators completed their preparations and withdrew to a safe distance, leaving behind only the means of Darnley's destruction. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, the final phase of the operation began. Someone, history will never record exactly who, approached Kirk O'Field carrying the flame that would ignite the fuses. This moment required nerves of steel and perfect timing. Too early, and Mary's alibi at Holyrood Palace might be questioned. Too late, and the winter dawn might expose the conspiracy to unwanted witnesses. The fuses caught fire with a soft hiss, and the countdown to explosion began. Minutes passed, long enough for the flames to travel through the building's foundations, reaching the carefully positioned barrels of gunpowder. In his bed above, Darnley may have heard strange sounds, smelled smoke, or felt the tremor of expanding gases building pressure beneath him. If he had any warning of his fate, it lasted only seconds. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, Kirk O'Field ceased to exist. The explosion was so massive that it shattered windows throughout Edinburgh and sent chunks of stone flying hundreds of yards in every direction. The sound was heard from the castle to the port, waking every citizen and sending them rushing to their windows in terror. When the smoke cleared and the debris stopped falling, the perfect crime scene awaited discovery, a scene so puzzling that it would baffle investigators for centuries to come. The first investigators to reach the smoking ruins of Kirk O'Field encountered a crime scene that defied every expectation of explosive death. Where they should have found charred corpses buried under tons of rubble, they instead discovered one of history's most perplexing forensic puzzles. Evidence so contradictory that modern crime scene analysts still struggle to reconcile the physical facts with any single theory of murder. Lord Darnley's body lay in a garden approximately 40 yards from the destroyed house, positioned as if he had simply lain down to sleep under the winter stars. He was completely naked, his pale skin unmarked by burns, cuts, or any trauma consistent with explosive force. His face, though bearing the scars of his recent illness, showed no expression of terror or pain. Instead, there was an almost peaceful quality to his features that suggested a quick, perhaps unexpected death. Beside Darnley lay his personal servant, William Taylor, equally naked and equally pristine. The positioning of both bodies was unnaturally precise. They were parallel to each other, heads aligned, arms at their sides, as if arranged by an undertaker rather than flung there by the chaos of an explosion. No forensic investigator examining this scene today would conclude that these men had died in the blast that destroyed Kirk O'Field. The physical evidence scattered around the bodies told an even stranger story. Darnley's nightgown lay several feet away, apparently removed rather than torn from his body by explosive force. One of his slippers sat nearby, while its mate was found yards away in the opposite direction. A chair stood upright next to the bodies, completely undamaged despite the violence that had supposedly killed the men beside it. A rope lay coiled near Darnley's feet, its presence never adequately explained by any subsequent investigation. Most puzzling of all was the condition of the bodies themselves. Explosion victims typically display distinctive injury patterns: burst eardrums, lung damage from pressure waves, embedded debris, and severe burns from the flash of ignition. Darnley and Taylor showed none of these markers. Instead, both men appeared to have died from suffocation or strangulation, though the darkness and the investigators' limited forensic knowledge prevented definitive determination of the cause of death. The absence of the third household member, Thomas Nelson, the young page, added another layer to the mystery. His body was eventually discovered in the ruins of the house, burned and crushed as explosion victims should be. This stark contrast between Nelson's death and the pristine condition of his master and fellow servant suggested that different fates had befallen the three men, despite their proximity when the blast occurred. Contemporary investigators, lacking modern forensic techniques, focused on the obvious questions. How had Darnley and Taylor traveled 40 yards from a collapsing building without sustaining any injuries? Why were they naked when found, when servants reported they had retired fully clothed? What force could have moved two grown men that distance while leaving them positioned so precisely? The most logical explanation, that the men had somehow escaped the initial explosion only to be murdered in the garden, raised even more disturbing questions. If Darnley had fled the house, who had killed him outside? Why had his killers taken time to remove his clothing and arrange his body so carefully? What did the rope signify, and why had it been left at the scene? Physical evidence from the explosion itself only deepened the mystery. The quantity of gunpowder required to level Kirk O'Field was enormous. Contemporary estimates suggested at least 20 barrels of powder had been used. Such an explosion should have created a crater and scattered debris across a much wider area. Instead, the destruction was contained and directional, suggesting either remarkable luck or sophisticated knowledge of demolition techniques. The pattern of damage to surrounding buildings provided additional clues about the explosion's intensity and direction. Windows were shattered in a fan pattern extending southeast from Kirk O'Field, indicating that the blast had been channeled rather than radiating uniformly in all directions. This controlled destruction suggested military expertise in the placement of charges, knowledge that pointed toward professional involvement rather than amateur enthusiasm. Weather conditions on the night of the explosion had been harsh, with strong winds and near-freezing temperatures. These factors should have affected both the blast pattern and the condition of any bodies exposed to the elements. Yet Darnley and Taylor showed no signs of exposure, despite lying naked in a garden during a Scottish winter night. Their bodies appeared fresh, as if death had occurred shortly before discovery rather than hours earlier. The immediate response to the scene's discovery revealed additional suspicious elements. Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived at Kirk O'Field within hours of the explosion, but her reaction was notably controlled for a woman who had just lost her husband in such violent circumstances. She asked few questions about the forensic details and seemed more concerned with managing the political implications than understanding the physical evidence. Most tellingly, the official investigation that followed focused on the explosion itself rather than the puzzling condition of the bodies. Questions about how Darnley had died were subordinated to speculation about who had provided the gunpowder. This investigative approach ensured that the most compelling evidence, the forensic impossibility of the crime scene, was largely ignored in favor of more politically convenient theories. The bodies in the garden represented evidence that couldn't be explained away by any simple narrative of accidental death or straightforward assassination. They demanded answers that no one in 1567 was prepared to provide, creating a mystery that would outlast the kingdom itself. In the web of conspiracy surrounding Lord Darnley's death, no thread was more crucial or more damning than the connection to James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell. This was a man whose very name had become synonymous with violence and political intrigue, a nobleman whose rise to power had been built on calculated brutality and whose relationship with Mary, Queen of Scots, represented either Scotland's salvation or its ultimate corruption. Bothwell was everything that Darnley was not: militarily competent, politically shrewd, and possessed of the kind of ruthless pragmatism that made him invaluable to a queen under constant threat. Where Darnley brought chaos and weakness to Mary's reign, Bothwell offered strength and stability. He had proven his loyalty through years of faithful service, defending Mary's interests when other nobles wavered or betrayed her outright. By 1567, he had become the most powerful man in Scotland after the Queen herself. The Earl's military background made him uniquely qualified to orchestrate the kind of sophisticated assassination that destroyed Kirk O'Field. Unlike the court dandies who surrounded Mary, Bothwell understood siege warfare, demolition, and the logistics of moving large quantities of explosive material without detection. His position as lieutenant of the Scottish borders had given him access to military supplies and the loyalty of hardened soldiers who would ask no questions about unusual orders. More significantly, Bothwell controlled Edinburgh Castle, the massive fortress that dominated the Scottish capital and housed the kingdom's primary armory. The gunpowder used to destroy Kirk O'Field had almost certainly come from the castle's stores, requisitioned under Bothwell's authority for what he would have described as legitimate security purposes. No other noble in Scotland could have accessed such quantities of military explosives without arousing immediate suspicion. The Earl's relationship with Mary had evolved far beyond the typical bond between sovereign and subject. Contemporary observers noted the Queen's increasing dependence on Bothwell's counsel, her obvious pleasure in his company, and the way she deferred to his judgment on matters that she would never have discussed with her husband. Whether this relationship had become romantic before Darnley's death remains historically debated, but the emotional intimacy between Mary and Bothwell was undeniable. Bothwell's hatred for Darnley was equally obvious and far more dangerous. The two men represented completely incompatible visions of Mary's future. Darnley demanded recognition as king in his own right, while Bothwell saw himself as Mary's protector and the true power behind her throne. Their rivalry had escalated throughout 1566, with Bothwell increasingly frustrated by Darnley's interference in state affairs and Darnley growing ever more resentful of the Earl's influence over his wife. The logistics of the Kirk O'Field operation bore Bothwell's distinctive signature. The careful timing, the military precision of the explosive placement, and the sophisticated escape planning all reflected his strategic mind. More tellingly, the choice of accomplices revealed Bothwell's network of loyal followers. Men like James Balfour, whose brother owned Kirk O'Field, and various border reivers whose loyalty had been purchased through years of profitable cooperation. Evidence of Bothwell's direct involvement in the conspiracy began emerging within days of the explosion. Servants reported seeing the Earl near Kirk O'Field on multiple occasions during Darnley's convalescence, always with plausible explanations for his presence, but always at times that would have allowed for reconnaissance or preparation. His movements on the night of February 9th were particularly suspicious. Multiple witnesses placed him in locations that would have provided perfect oversight of the operation's final phases. The Earl's behavior immediately after the explosion raised additional questions. While Mary appeared shocked by her husband's death, Bothwell seemed remarkably composed and well prepared for the aftermath. He took immediate control of the investigation, ostensibly to protect the Queen's interests, but actually to ensure that the inquiry focused on politically convenient suspects rather than the physical evidence that might implicate him. Most damning of all was Bothwell's rapid consolidation of power following Darnley's death. Within weeks, he had eliminated potential rivals, secured control of the young Prince James, and positioned himself as Mary's indispensable protector against unnamed enemies. This swift political maneuvering suggested advanced planning that extended far beyond the immediate assassination. Bothwell hadn't simply killed Darnley. He had prepared to inherit his position. The Earl's treatment of potential witnesses revealed his awareness of the conspiracy's vulnerabilities. Several servants who had been at Kirk O'Field on the night of the explosion disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances in the weeks that followed. Others received sudden promotions or land grants that ensured their silence. This systematic elimination of loose ends demonstrated the same methodical approach that had characterized the original assassination plan. Bothwell's relationship with the other suspected conspirators followed patterns of loyalty and reward that stretched back years. These were not random associates drawn into a spontaneous plot, but carefully cultivated allies whose involvement had been planned and prepared over time. The Earl had built his network of accomplices through a combination of financial incentives, political advancement, and shared interests that made their cooperation in Darnley's murder almost inevitable. Perhaps most significantly, Bothwell's actions in the months following the explosion revealed his ultimate ambition. The murder of Darnley had been merely the first phase of a larger plan, one that would culminate in Bothwell's own marriage to Mary and his assumption of royal power. The Kirk-o'-Field conspiracy wasn't simply about eliminating an inconvenient husband. It was about clearing the path for Scotland's most dangerous nobleman to claim the throne itself. The investigation into Lord Darnley's murder would ultimately focus its most damning scrutiny on the one person who stood to gain most from his death: Mary, Queen of Scots herself. As evidence mounted and witness testimony accumulated, a horrifying picture emerged of a sovereign who had not merely failed to protect her husband, but had actively participated in orchestrating his destruction. Mary's behavior in the weeks leading up to the explosion revealed a pattern of deception that chilled even her most loyal supporters. Her sudden decision to personally nurse Darnley through his illness, after months of avoiding him entirely, struck courtiers as suspiciously convenient. The queen, who had publicly humiliated her husband, refused to share his bed, and made no secret of her contempt, was suddenly playing the devoted wife with theatrical precision. The choice of Kirk-o'-Field as Darnley's convalescent residence raised immediate questions about Mary's motives. She had personally selected the isolated house, overriding suggestions from Darnley's physicians that he would recover better in the familiar surroundings of Holyrood Palace. Her insistence on the remote location, combined with her detailed involvement in furnishing the house, suggested advanced knowledge of what was planned to happen there. More troubling were the specific items Mary had moved into Kirk-o'-Field for Darnley's comfort. Among the tapestries, furniture, and personal effects was a beautiful silver bath that she claimed would aid his recovery. Investigators later discovered that this same bath had been positioned directly above one of the rooms where gunpowder was stored, a placement that would have helped muffle any sounds of preparation while ensuring maximum structural damage when the explosion occurred. Mary's activities on the night of February 9th provided the most damaging evidence against her. Her visit to Kirk-o'-Field had been planned weeks in advance, ostensibly to spend a quiet evening with her recovering husband. Yet her behavior during those final hours with Darnley was recorded by multiple servants as strangely theatrical. She was affectionate beyond belief, almost desperately so, as if performing for an audience rather than expressing genuine emotion. The timing of Mary's departure from Kirk-o'-Field was equally suspicious. She had promised Darnley a longer visit, perhaps even staying the night, but suddenly discovered an urgent need to return to Holyrood Palace. The wedding celebration she claimed required her immediate attention had been proceeding smoothly for hours without royal intervention. Her abrupt departure, coming exactly when it did, provided her with the perfect alibi while ensuring she was safely away when the explosion occurred. Most damning was Mary's reaction to news of her husband's death. Messengers reached Holyrood Palace within an hour of the explosion, yet multiple witnesses described the Queen's response as remarkably composed. She asked few questions about the circumstances of Darnley's death and showed little interest in the forensic details that should have mystified anyone encountering such an unprecedented crime scene. Instead, she immediately began referring to the incident as a mischance, an unfortunate accident rather than obvious murder. The speed with which Mary moved to control the investigation revealed her awareness of its potential dangers. Within hours of learning about the explosion, she had appointed investigators whose loyalty to the crown was absolute. She issued specific instructions about which aspects of the case should receive attention and which should be considered secondary. Most tellingly, she showed far more concern about managing public perception than discovering the truth about her husband's death. Mary's relationship with the Earl of Bothwell provided additional grounds for suspicion. Their emotional intimacy had become court gossip long before Darnley's death, with observers noting the Queen's obvious preference for Bothwell's company and her increasing dependence on his counsel. The possibility that their relationship had become romantic and that Darnley's murder had been motivated by passion as much as politics added a scandalous dimension to the investigation. The Queen's knowledge of the conspiracy's details became apparent through seemingly innocent comments and decisions. She knew exactly which servants had been at Kirk O'Field on the night of the explosion, understood the layout of the house better than investigators who had examined it, and made references to timing and logistics that suggested intimate familiarity with the operations planning. Her attempts to appear ignorant only highlighted how much she actually knew. Physical evidence linked Mary directly to the conspiracy through items found at the scene. Personal belongings that she had given to Darnley were positioned in ways that suggested advanced knowledge of the explosion's effects. Her own furniture had been placed to minimize damage to valuable pieces while maximizing the blast's impact on the building structure. Even the arrangement of Darnley's quarters seemed designed to ensure he would be in the most vulnerable position when the explosives detonated. Mary's treatment of potential witnesses followed patterns that suggested guilty knowledge. Servants who might have compromising information received generous rewards or sudden transfers to distant positions. Others found themselves facing accusations of theft or disloyalty that effectively silenced them. The systematic nature of these actions indicated advanced planning rather than spontaneous damage control. Perhaps most significantly, Mary's actions in the weeks following Darnley's death revealed the conspiracy's ultimate purpose. Her increasing reliance on Bothwell, her apparent preparation for widowhood, and her rapid acceptance of a new political arrangement all suggested that Darnley's murder had been merely the first phase of a larger plan. The Queen had not simply tolerated her husband's assassination. She had actively participated in creating the circumstances that made it possible. The evidence against Mary was largely circumstantial, but its cumulative weight was overwhelming. She had motive, opportunity, and means. More damaging still, she had behaved exactly as a guilty person would behave, making decisions and taking actions that served no purpose other than concealing her involvement in royal murder. The official investigation into Lord Darnley's murder was a masterpiece of misdirection from its very inception. A carefully orchestrated performance designed not to uncover the truth, but to conceal it beneath layers of false leads, convenient scapegoats, and willful blindness to the most obvious evidence. Yet despite the conspirators' best efforts, their elaborate cover-up began unraveling almost immediately, undermined by their own arrogance, the persistence of inconvenient witnesses, and the simple impossibility of hiding such a spectacular crime. Mary appointed a commission of inquiry within days of the explosion, selecting investigators whose primary qualification was their absolute loyalty to the Crown rather than their investigative abilities. The commission was instructed to examine the mischance at Kirk O'Field, a deliberate framing that suggested accidental death rather than premeditated murder. This linguistic sleight of hand established the investigation's limitations before it even began. They were looking for causes of an accident, not evidence of assassination. The Earl of Bothwell, despite being the most obvious suspect, was placed in effective control of the investigation. His authority over Edinburgh Castle gave him access to witnesses, evidence, and the crime scene itself, allowing him to shape the inquiry's direction and suppress inconvenient discoveries. When investigators found gunpowder residue in patterns that suggested military expertise, Bothwell redirected their attention toward more politically acceptable theories involving foreign agents or Protestant conspirators. The first major crack in the cover-up came from an unexpected source: anonymous placards that began appearing throughout Edinburgh within days of the explosion. These crude but effective broadsheets depicted Bothwell as a murderer and Mary as his accomplice, complete with illustrations showing the Earl lighting the fuses that destroyed Kirk O'Field. The placards' detailed knowledge of the conspiracy's mechanics suggested they had been created by someone with inside information, possibly a conspirator seeking to protect himself by exposing his fellow plotters. More damaging were the servants who had survived the explosion but refused to remain silent about what they had witnessed. Despite bribes, threats, and mysterious disappearances that eliminated the most dangerous witnesses, several household members persisted in telling their stories. Their accounts of suspicious activities in the days before the explosion, of strange men moving through Kirk O'Field at night, and of Mary's peculiar behavior during her final visit to her husband could not be entirely suppressed. The physical evidence at the crime scene presented insurmountable problems for the official narrative. The positioning of Darnley's body, the pristine condition of the corpses, and the sophisticated nature of the explosion all contradicted the theory of accidental death. When investigators attempted to explain these anomalies, their explanations became increasingly convoluted and implausible, drawing more attention to the very facts they were trying to obscure. International pressure added another dimension to the cover-up's collapse. Elizabeth I of England, alarmed by the implications of royal murder so close to her own border, dispatched agents to conduct independent investigations. French ambassadors, representing Mary's former allies, began asking pointed questions about the circumstances of Darnley's death. The conspiracy that had been designed to solve Mary's domestic problems was rapidly becoming an international scandal. The most devastating blow to the cover-up came from within the conspiracy itself. James Balfour, whose family had provided Kirk O'Field as the murder scene, began to fear that he would be sacrificed to protect more powerful conspirators. His decision to preserve evidence rather than destroy it, including documents that detailed the plot's logistics and financing, created a time bomb that would eventually destroy everyone involved. Bothwell's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control only highlighted his guilt. His intimidation of witnesses became so blatant that it drew attention from previously neutral observers. His manipulation of the official investigation became so obvious that even his supporters began to question his motives. Most damaging of all, his rapid consolidation of power following Darnley's death looked exactly like what it was: the actions of a man who had planned to benefit from his victim's destruction. Mary's behavior during this period revealed the psychological toll of maintaining such an elaborate deception. Her public appearances became increasingly erratic, alternating between brutal gaiety and profound melancholy in ways that suggested guilty knowledge rather than innocent grief. Her attempts to appear normally widowed only emphasized how abnormal her circumstances truly were. The religious dimension of the scandal added fuel to the investigative fire. Protestant ministers, already suspicious of Mary's Catholic faith, seized upon Darnley's murder as evidence of papal corruption. Their sermons and pamphlets kept the case in the public eye, ensuring that popular pressure for justice continued to build even as official investigations stalled. The Kirk's moral authority gave religious critics a platform that secular investigators lacked. Popular unrest in Edinburgh reached dangerous levels as citizens realized that their queen might be a murderess. Riots broke out when Bothwell appeared in public, forcing him to travel with armed guards and avoid certain areas of the city entirely. The political stability that the conspiracy had been designed to create was dissolving into chaos that threatened the monarchy itself. The final unraveling accelerated when Mary made the catastrophic decision to marry Bothwell just 3 months after Darnley's death. This union, which should have represented the conspiracy's ultimate triumph, instead provided irrefutable proof of the plotter's guilt. No innocent widow would marry her husband's suspected murderer so quickly, and no loyal subject would accept a crown obtained through assassination. The cover-up that had begun with such sophistication and confidence collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, leaving Mary and Bothwell exposed to charges that would ultimately cost them everything: throne, freedom, and in Mary's case, eventually her life. The murder of Lord Darnley became more than a simple assassination. It became a cancer that consumed the Scottish monarchy, destroyed lives across multiple kingdoms, and created ripple effects that would reshape European politics for generations. What began as a calculated solution to Mary's marital problems became the instrument of her own destruction, proving that some crimes are too monstrous to remain hidden, no matter how carefully they are planned or how powerful their perpetrators. The immediate aftermath of the Kirk O'Field explosion saw Mary make a series of catastrophically poor decisions that transformed suspicion into certainty and political damage into complete disaster. Her marriage to the Earl of Bothwell on May 15, 1567, barely 3 months after her husband's murder, was perhaps the most self-destructive act in royal history. No amount of political necessity could justify such apparent callousness, and no explanation could make the union appear as anything other than the reward of a co-conspirator. The wedding itself was a grim affair, conducted according to Protestant rites despite Mary's Catholic faith, a compromise that satisfied no one while offending everyone. Bothwell had obtained his freedom to marry through a conveniently rapid divorce from his existing wife, a process that reeked of corruption and political manipulation. The ceremony was attended by a handful of terrified nobles who dared not refuse the Queen's invitation, but whose presence felt more like a funeral than a celebration. Scottish public opinion, already inflamed by months of speculation about the royal murder, erupted in fury. The marriage confirmed every suspicion about Mary and Bothwell's relationship, providing definitive proof that Darnley's death had been motivated by adulterous passion as much as political convenience. Riots broke out across Scotland as citizens realized their queen had not merely failed to seek justice for her husband's murder. She had married his killer and made him their king. The Scottish nobility, many of whom had tolerated or even supported the conspiracy against Darnley, found themselves unable to accept Bothwell as their sovereign. Within weeks of the marriage, a confederation of lords had formed to oppose the new regime, raising armies and declaring their intention to rescue Mary from Bothwell's influence. What they actually intended was to remove both Mary and Bothwell from power, recognizing that the Darnley murder had made their continued rule impossible. The confrontation came at Carberry Hill on June 15, 1567, where Mary and Bothwell faced the Confederate lords with a pitifully small army of loyal supporters. The battle that everyone expected never occurred. Instead, negotiations throughout the day made it clear that Mary's position was hopeless. Bothwell, realizing that continued resistance would mean death for both of them, agreed to flee Scotland in exchange for Mary's safety. It was the last time husband and wife would see each other. Mary's subsequent captivity marked the beginning of a 19-year ordeal that would end only with her execution at Fotheringay Castle in 1587. Imprisoned first in Scotland and then in England, she became a perpetual threat to Protestant rule and a symbol of Catholic resistance. Her involvement in Darnley's murder provided Elizabeth I with the perfect justification for keeping her cousin under house arrest, preventing any attempt to claim the English throne while maintaining the fiction of treating her as a fellow sovereign. Bothwell's fate was even more tragic, if less dramatic. His flight from Scotland led him to Denmark, where he was imprisoned by King Frederick II and held in increasingly harsh conditions until his death in 1578. The man who had once been the most powerful noble in Scotland died insane and forgotten in a Danish dungeon, his mind broken by 11 years of solitary confinement. His body was mummified and displayed as a curiosity for centuries, a grotesque reminder of how completely his ambitions had been destroyed. The investigation into Darnley's murder continued sporadically for years, but justice remained elusive. Several minor conspirators were executed, including some who had played relatively small roles in the plot, while the principal architects of the crime escaped formal punishment. The evidence that might have convicted Mary and Bothwell was suppressed, destroyed, or conveniently lost, ensuring that the full truth about Kirk O'Field would remain hidden. James VI, Mary's infant son, who became king upon her abdication, grew up knowing that his mother was widely believed to have murdered his father. This knowledge shaped his character and his reign, making him perpetually suspicious of noble conspiracies while paradoxically forgiving toward his mother's memory. When he inherited the English throne as James I, he chose not to pursue further investigations into his father's death, perhaps recognizing that some secrets were better left buried. The Darnley murder established a template for royal scandal that would influence European politics for centuries. It demonstrated that even absolute monarchs could not commit crimes with impunity, that public opinion had become a force that kings and queens ignored at their peril, and that the price of political murder might ultimately exceed its benefits. The case became a cautionary tale, told in every European court about the dangers of mixing passion with power. Modern forensic analysis has added new dimensions to the mystery without resolving its fundamental questions. The positioning of the bodies, the nature of the explosion, and the timeline of events continue to puzzle investigators, suggesting that even our advanced understanding of crime scene evidence cannot fully explain what happened at Kirk Field. The case remains one of history's most compelling unsolved murders, a puzzle that has outlasted the kingdom it destroyed. The ultimate irony of Darnley's death is that it achieved none of its intended goals while creating consequences that no one had anticipated. Mary lost her throne instead of securing it. Bothwell died in exile instead of ruling Scotland, and the monarchy itself was weakened rather than strengthened. The conspiracy that was meant to solve Mary's problems became the source of far greater disasters, proving that some crimes create more chaos than they eliminate. What's your take on this case? Did Mary, Queen of Scots, orchestrate her husband's murder, or was she merely a victim of circumstances beyond her control? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking.